Hi, I'm Draft, and you're watching the Inside the Project video for All For You Part 1, which is off my new EP Grimy Scraps. Available now. So the first thing you'll notice about this video is I'm not actually using any hands. I was away, traveling, projects crashed, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so the tune itself is pretty small. The project file is pretty small. I've organized everything. I've organized the melody, the effects, the bass and mids, which aren't much of anyway, and the drums. Now, if you haven't heard the track, this is how it goes. I need to expand that, yeah. So then basically I've got a filter that opens up to introduce the introduction of the track, which is a vocal sample from years and years ago, 2008, 2009. And I also have an absinthe synth, VST, just playing a low, almost bell kind of melody that will accompany the intro vocals. Then I reintroduce everything else, including additional melodies, some vocal chops, which keep the track interesting to a build before it comes towards the breakdown. Now, the breakdown wasn't meant to be anything special because it was a retraction before this. Aided heavily by the sub and the bass. Now, the bass has some automation on it, not too much, just enough to keep it interesting and keep some movement in the groove, because I wanted the bass and sub to groove with the drums. Bass on its own, quite thick, quite clean, aided massively by the 808. And then I've got the drums, which are just groove based. They're not designed to be sonically demanding. They just aid the backbone of the track, essentially. I've also introduced some glitched almost chops of the vocals. And then as I go throughout the track, I reintroduce the sampled vocals that were taken up, or pitched up, should I say, an octave higher, just to give it a bit more of a harmonic flavor. But it's quite a small tune. It didn't need to be. It wasn't meant to be anything dramatic. It wasn't meant to be this big engulfing, because that's not what the downtempo projects were about, essentially. They were built to be just me on my own, without confinement, without a boundary, just writing as I'd like to write. So I'm able to write freely, use the samples I want freely, and just go from there. Right, so first up is the melody side of things, which is quite minimal, but effective, I like to think. It's basically a vocal sample with some additional synths, some vocal chops that are then glitched, a sitar that sits underneath, and then this weird Prophet kind of plucking thing that I added. Anyway, the main sample, which was made in 2008, 2009, I forget now. It's actually called Do Something With This, which I did. Has the filter, which ushers it in nice and smoothly. And then when it came to the processing side of things, this is obviously a dry. Because it's a sample that is looped, the way the original sample was recorded in the amateur days of me working meant that I had to process it in such a way that it didn't sound like it was looping too obvious, or obviously, should I say. So I had the Valhalla room, which helped that, and then I put on some EQs where I boosted certain frequencies, but then I pulled back the finer adjustments, as it were. So I'm still getting the curves from the boost, but I can refine the details by pulling them back. Now, I mentioned about the additional pitched vocal harmony accompanying kind of samples for what they are, and they are essentially just two pitched up that are panned left and right. They loop pretty much the same as the lower sample. They have some effects on, which is the camel fat and the Valhalla room, just to give it that bit more rounding touch. And then together they sit nicely just on top. A bit more obvious with the filter when it comes in, to obviously, as again, to help usher them in. Pretty simple. I mean, it was one of those that I always wanted to do something with the sample. As I said, it was initially called Johnny Bass because there was a guy called Johnny who played the melody that I'd created on bass guitar. Anyway, I digress. So the melody itself is accompanied by an instance of Absinthe 5, which is playing the melody replicated in almost like a sine. Almost like a sine bell tone. Now this is dry. Obviously the room, Valhalla room, again, the reverb spreads it out. There's a bit of delay via the mod, and there's some EQ on it just to pull back some offending frequencies. And then when it gets to the transition of the progression, I then start adding the additional little notes that kind of spice it up a little, which I love to do anyway. Now that runs pretty much throughout the track, and then it has an accompanying melody, which is also, I believe, done in, no, it's done in Massive, actually. Incorrect. This also runs, it's the Friday hit, which is in my track Friday 2013, whenever it was. It's just that synth kind of reused. This is it dry. Valhalla room, again, the reverb just to give it a bit of tail and some delay. I've used a stereo enhancer, which I try to avoid every now and then, but I can't help it. And some EQ. And when they're both playing together, it creates a nice little tonal, soothing tonal attribute. Again, I've got the accompanying mixture of notes to add a bit of variation, but run in a beautiful kind of harmonizing way. Now the vocal chops, 3 instances of 3 different vocals and something I call bleepers, which is like a This is the bleepers. Very sporadic. Doesn't actually happen often. And then the vocal chops of pan 1 right and pan 1 left. And the other one I've kept center. Now with the bleepers, they're just to add another element, another aspect to the melody. Now this is them dry. Bit OTT to roughen it and add a bit of high end basically to it. Overdrive the high end. I've put the camel fat on it, probably for a limiter. And the EQ, as you can see, is just pulling back certain offending frequencies out of it. Now, obviously, I use the Edison to record the loop itself, and then I use an instance of glitch or 2, maybe, just to spice it up, give it a bit of variation. Now, with the bells, or the melody, should I say, just creates a bit more of a dynamic kind of environment for the track to venture to. This part, the glitching goes a bit chaotic purely because when I added in the other elements, they kind of bounce off each other, which we'll cover anyway. So, all in all, the melody is pretty simple in that regards, but it needed extra added elements. So the sitar was one of them. This is it dry. Processed. Very faint, a very faint undertone that you can hear. I want to boost it a little. Just subtle. Didn't need to be anything dramatic or commanding. Just sat underneath on certain bars just to give it that little... I wanted to treat it like if someone could hear it. You'd be like, oh, what was that? Now the Prophet is 8 chords with a filter on. Bit of processing on. This is dry. I've got the OTT to give it a bit of balls, pardon the pun. some EQ. I've put a compressor on it to drive it. I've got the stereo enhancer and a Valhalla room to add a bit of, you know, the tail that leads into the next bar, basically. And it's just something that aids transitions again, because it's meant to be subtle. It isn't meant to be dramatic, but the timing of it just helps progress into the latter stages of the song. Now that's pretty much the melody to begin with. I mean, it's minimal. It doesn't need to be dramatic. Runs throughout the track. It was purely designed to sit and just aid the track. It didn't need to drive it. It wasn't the process of it, but simple. So let's jump right into the effects. Again, not many, and I've grouped them together. I like this system. I'm going to start using that more. Anyway, very few effects. I've minimized the filters and the modulation or modulated envelopes that I've included on them. So the first effect that you hear in the track sounds like there's a lot going on, but not really. There's a filter and a volume multiplier. So I've acted like an LFO. I've created an envelope on the volume. There we go. Not too dramatic. Without. Just gives it a bit more of a groove, but B, a bit more tension. Helps usher in, you know? These tracks are all about groove. And as it runs throughout the track, it maintains the same speed, the same tempo of the envelope. Again, there's no emphasis on dramatic in this. So the next effect, it's kind of like a creeping kind of glass thing. Very weird. I'd panned it left because if I'd kept it in the stereo field as it was, it would sound to the right. So I panned it almost a hard left to keep it a bit more in sync on both sides. And again, there's a fair bit of processing on that one, but it's meant to fit in such a way that it sounds good on its own, but it also sounds well in tandem. Now this effect has a filter, camel fat filter, just opening up. Fair bit of processing going on. If I dry the signals, awful. Slowly getting there. Now the EQ, again, emphasis a bit on the low end. Bit of saturation. Valhalla room to give it more of a dimension. Another EQ and a bit of a stereo enhancer just to widen it out a bit. And it just sits almost like a growl, an envelope growl. Nothing really to pay attention to that. I just left it in there because I'm messy. But again, it adds a bit of tension, as it were, to keep an almost subtle undertone, you know? That's almost like a flyby effect. Very minimal process, and I've got an EQ on it, which, as you can see, takes away quite a lot of the sound. And the Valhalla room. So that's too aggressive. That was too dynamic to sit in the mix. So I just pulled it back. The Valhalla room again, widen it out. Only used once throughout the track, just to give a bit of variation to what can be perceived as a very monotonous track. Just don't let me hear you say that. This last effect is like a wailing kind of spitfire effect. The EQ, I've pulled out some of the harsher frequencies around the 3000 mark. And there's also a Valhalla room on it. Now when I play that with the drums, you hear it usher in each groove. that was the sole principle of it. It was just add another little layer throughout certain sections of the track. Bit of spice, as we say. Again, minimal amounts of effects. They're very sparsely used. They're not there to detract away from the actual intention of the track. They're there as a tool to aid. And sometimes I'll overuse effects to emphasize a dramatic feature, but they didn't need to be in this track. And as you can see, 5, 6 channels, whatever it is, just sitting over the top. Didn't have to be anything protruding, too forward. If anything, they sit back in the mix and only help aid the transition between bars, or between verse chorus, if that's what you can call it. Right, now onto the bass. Relatively simple. The patterns are actually just mimicked on both sides of the track. So that side is pretty much copied onto that side. But it works. Doesn't really matter. It's a 808, or muddy 808, and an instance of citrus for the top end of the bass. Now the sub has some processing on it. Can't remember where I got the sample from. It's got an isotope trash 2, an EQ, fat filter prime beat, and a camel fat. This is dry. Now the isotope trash 2 was to drive it as much as I could, almost borderline distorting and saturating it, but that's what I wanted. So the low end has clip control, and there's nothing else on the other 2 bands, so it gives it a lot of low end and upper low end drive. The EQ is pulling away certain areas where it gets a bit harsh, or it will clog up the mix frequency wise. The Pro MB, I was originally putting it to, I believe I originally put it to compress or do something, but then when I put it on solo, it just sounded warmer, slightly duller, but a bit more warmer and thicker. So I thought, why not keep it? And Camel Fat, I've literally just used it as a limiter. So it's all default, but I've just pulled the master volume back. And as I said, it's literally copied and pasted. Copy and pasted to the next section of the track after that middle breakdown. Now, this bass sounds pretty flat and rubbish, really. It's made in citrus, which I've started to love. It uses, I think it uses 2 or 3 operators, and I think I used 2 in citrus. I can't remember. However, there's some automation on the cutoff. So that envelope is ultimately controlling the cutoff. There's a second, which is a parametric EQ, where I've got 2 instances of bands being automated, like this. This is an old way I used to work, and I still enjoy doing it now. I find it simple, and I like to see them dancing, basically. So I've got one control on the low end, and then another, which kind of just pulls the high end out towards the upper mids and just drives it back in. So it creates movement. Now, sometimes I have to intertwine a pit drop or something, just for that additional movement. And then when you combine that with the automation, sounds awful. But that's how you create the uneasy kind of, almost the neuro drum and bass style, you know? But again, that's copied and pasted to the other part. Whenever I am doing a new one, I'll just make unique for the FL Studio users. Now the processing behind it, this is dry. Terrible. Some EQ, which is the original automated one. Some saturation, just give it a bit of thump. Some chorus. Another parametric EQ2, which is boosting certain frequencies just to give it a bit of I don't want to use spice again, but you get the point. Compression, which is really driving it and evening it out. Another instance of parametric EQ, which is giving it a bit of low. It's taking out the bottom end, it's giving it a bit of low end drive and really bringing out that distorted high end. The Pro MB, which is just tightening things up. And then the Valhalla Room, which, I mean, shouldn't use reverb on bass, all this sort of stuff, but part of the downtempo projects is just merely about being free and creative and sometimes breaking rules. And then when it came to certain parts of the track, like this breakdown, that's where the Valhalla Room really came into its own, because it would reverb around the drums. So it adds another dynamic, a bit of depth, really. I suppose that's what I was really aiming for, was a bit of depth behind the space, because you want it to read like a painting, you know, layers upon layers. Now all together with the drums, fits. And on the master, I've got into the habit of running a parametric EQ too, just so I can dip out all the top end and just see if it sits cleanly with the low end and the kick and things like that. In this instance it did, so I didn't actually really have to sidechain too much. So I didn't even have to really get technical. That's basically the bass. The notes are pretty repetitive. Citrus is another thing I like. It took me a while to get into it, but I like being able to mess around with the operators and just experiment, because any little knob tweak, you can warp the sound massively. Right, finally the drums. Not too many used. It was aimed for a retracted delivery whilst having a bit of presence. There's a couple of kicks, snare, some additional percussion which sits as a bass, and there's also automation on the hats. But this is how it sounds. Emphasis on groove, additional one-shots to help the structure travel. First up is a kick, which is groove based in its delivery. It's basically rooted to a kick and snare bus, which I can basically sidechain off whenever I want to. Not too much, nothing too dramatic. Now, obviously, on this there has an EQ, and this is of an EQ which dampens the tone, just helps it sit under for what it's worth. There's a Vengeance kick. No processing on that. Again, that's rooted to the kick and bus snare. Kick and snare bus, rather. And on the kick and snare bus is actually a transient master, a transient shaper, which has a bit of attack, and I've pulled back the sustain. And at the end, obviously, the camel fat, which acts as a limiter on its default settings. Then there's a boomy bass drum, which acts as a stomp, which adds to the groove of its offset delivery in the arrangement. Then there's a snare, which is pretty tight. On that, there's some transient shaping and EQ and a Valhalla Room for the reverb. Again, that's rooted to the kick and snare bus. And then there's this kind of percussive one-shot thing that acts as a shuffle. It's kind of a strange one, but it works. It's the EQ, this is a dry. EQ, transient shaper, and some delay, which helps with the shuffling side of things. Now with the bulk of the drums, it kind of, it just adds another layer to sit around the bulk of the drum track, the backbone of it, should I say. Used a bit more prominently towards the end of the track, worth noting. And then with this emphasis again on the relationship between the drums and the bass and sub. But you can really hear how it shuffles in between tracks, which is really nice. It just adds another layer rather than adding the standard hi-hat or, you know, a random percussive tom or something like that, you know. Works really well with the Prophet synth as well, which I quite enjoyed. Yeah. I mean, that's the backbone of the track. And then move on to the hi-hats, or hi-hat, should I say. Dry. It's got some OTT for some distorted drive, basically. The Panamatic, which is triggered in the envelope, so I can have this stereo rhythm, as it were. And then I've got some EQ, which basically takes away quite a fair bit of the high end, so it's not too intrusive. And it just shuffles away, you know? It's an additional layer for the groove, back to the point of painting. You know, it's all layers, it all adds up. Then I've got another percussive hit, which is a one shot. Panned left, dry. Now there's some EQ, which just basically removes the low end, the reverb to give it a bit of space, and the transient master, which emphasizes the attack, but I pull back the sustain so it acts on the reverb, essentially. So it still contains reverb, but I've been able to retract it and have a bit more control over it. And that sits with the rest of the drums in such a way that it kind of adds that little shuffle. Yeah, it's just something to add to keep it interesting, essentially. Then I've got this weird reverse metal thing, which is pan right. It's used quite sparsely in the track. I mean, it's just a finer detail that I wanted to squeeze in somewhere. Now with the rest of the track, it's present once you know it's there. It's something that I like to input so people pick up on it, and if they might not have noticed it first time, gives you a reason to listen to it again and again and again and again. Finally, there's this break, which came from a sample pack by Break, who is the Don. Big up Break. Using the intro and the outro mainly. There's an EQ transient master, but this is it dry. Now the EQ is almost linear. It's just rolling off little bits here and there. The transient shaper is mainly the emphasis on the sustain. Its main aim was to give it a bit of a longer sample length, essentially. The Camel Fat, which I've engaged the filter on to roll off some high end and some low end. The Valhalla Room Reverb for distortion, quite like that. And the Pro MB, which acts within the two multi-band channels or frequency ranges that stereo sidechain against the kick and the snare. So when I have the kick and snare playing, it kind of it sits underneath the drum track, and again, it's not really using the bulk of the track. It's only the intros and outros, so it gives me a bit of leeway to be a bit more creative with the delivery of that sound. Now this section here highlights the emphasis of every bit that's used. I mean, it works nicely because it's just a simple groove. That's all that is often was required. With the track as a whole, you can hear everything working together, almost in harmony, pretty much. I mean, that's pretty much the bulk of the track. It's simple, it's tight and loose at the same time. It's big and it's bashy, but with precision. It's just utilizing the space as much as possible without being too intrusive to the listener. Again, that's the joy of this down-tempo stuff, because I can be creative. I can ignore the more linear and rigid rules of production, because it's all about conveying a feeling or emotion or putting the listener in a certain headspace, regardless of what that is, because obviously it's personal to anyone. But as long as I can do that, these tracks don't need to be any bigger than that, essentially.